Hello and welcome back to Ladies of Lore, the podcast where we take all of the most wonderful women of mythology and folklore and we unpick, unravel and explore their origins, their stories and how they've evolved through time to arrive in today's modern world. I'm India and I am so grateful to have you here with me today. If you're new to the podcast, welcome on in. I hope you enjoy it here, and if you do, please feel free to subscribe on your favourite podcast platform, and you can talk to me over on TikTok and Blue Sky too. And as it's finally April, I am super excited because the Patreon will be launching imminently, so keep an eye out for that. Anyway, let's talk about the subject of today's episode, because today we're going back to Greece. I feel like we've spent a lot of time in Greece recently, so next week won't be in Greece, but today we're diving deep into the enigmatic world of Circe, the sorceress of ancient Greece and a big fan of turning men into animals. Circe truly is one of the most fascinating women of Greek mythology. She's been called everything from a witch to a goddess, a temptress, and a destroyer of men. But she has also been seen as a protector and a healer, and an independent woman in a world dominated by male gods and warriors. I'm so excited to be talking about this one today, so get yourself comfy. I know some of you have told me that you listen on your commutes to work. Some of you have told me that you listen to help you get to sleep. So whatever you're doing, you're about to learn all about Circe. The first appearance of Circe comes in Homer's Odyssey, and here Homer describes her as the daughter of Helios, the sun god, and the Oceanid nymph Perse. It's also said that she has several siblings, including the wife of King Minos and the mother of the famous Minotaur, and Aeetes, known as the Keeper of the Golden Fleece. And there are also some ancient texts suggesting that she was actually the powerful goddess Hecate's daughter. Either way, this makes her what we'd probably call a minor goddess. But unlike other gods and goddesses of Olympus, Circe chooses to live in isolation on the island of Aeaea. And here she works on perfecting her magic. And this alone makes her pretty interesting, because if there's one thing that we know about other gods and goddesses, they love to seek power. They love to meddle in the lives of other gods or kings. They love a hero. But Circe, she just hasn't really got any time for that. Instead, she devotes her life to her craft. She's just out there doing her thing on her island. And speaking of the island, Homer describes it as an eerie yet enchanting place, filled with tame lions and wolves who turn out to be former men that she has transformed with her potions. Circe's appearance is not really explicitly detailed in Homer's text, but the descriptions of her home, her general sort of aura, and her interactions with Odysseus and his men strongly imply this sort of divine and captivating beauty. In classical Greek art, Circe is often shown as a striking woman with long flowing hair, sometimes adorned with a crown or a headband to signify her divine status. She's commonly associated with a wand or a staff, and these are key tools that she uses to transform men into animals. And the poet Hesiod, who we know very, very well by now on Ladies of Lore, refers to her in his Theogony as the daughter of Helios, the sun god, a lineage that further emphasises her radiance and her otherworldly allure. And this connection to Helios often associates her with golden light, a feature that may very well have contributed to her depiction with this sort of luminous air or ethereal glow. Vase paintings from the 5th and 4th centuries BCE often depict Circe as a regal woman, seated on a throne or standing in a commanding pose with a potion or a wand in hand. For instance, an Attic red figure crater from the classical period shows her extending a cup towards Odysseus, a reference to her role as a sorceress who uses potions. In these artworks, her clothing is often elaborate, featuring flowing robes that enhance her divine and mysterious persona. Roman interpretations, particularly in Ovid's Metamorphoses, add to her beauty by describing her as a temptress, with a voice capable of enchanting anyone who hears it. Ovid's version of Circe emphasises her desirability and her ability to seduce men, as well as to ensnare them with magic. And this literary portrayal suggests that her allure was not just physical, but it was also deeply tied to her voice and her charisma, and her mastery of supernatural forces. And speaking of Roman interpretations of Circe, her origins in Roman mythology come mostly from her Greek counterpart, but the Romans did expand her character, emphasising her role as both an enchantress and a symbol of transformation. And the most significant Roman source for Circe's myth is in fact Ovid's Metamorphoses, and this was written in the 1st century BCE, and we touched on this in the musical episode about the sirens last week, which, by the way, I really hope that you enjoyed. Actually, it wasn't last week, was it? It's 2 weeks ago. I'm a little bit behind. I do apologise. It's been one of those weeks where everything that I needed to do in my life all happened at once, so I'm a little bit behind, so I do apologise for that. But yeah, we spoke about this exact thing in the episode on the siren. So Metamorphoses is all about different types of transformation, and so Circe's story fits perfectly within its pages. In this epic poem, Circe is portrayed as a goddess of magic, descended from the Titan Helios and again the Oceanid Perse. And this divine lineage is exactly the same as the Greek tale, but it does reinforce Circe's connection to both celestial and oceanic powers, and that sort of in turn demonstrates her control over both nature and metamorphosis. And Ovid goes a little bit further on elaborating Circe's character and gives her a bit more of a developed emotional and psychological profile than what we find in earlier Greek sources. In Metamorphoses, she's depicted as a passionate and sometimes vengeful figure. One of the most notable episodes about her is her unrequited love for the mortal Picus. According to Ovid, Circe becomes enamoured with him. He's a handsome king of Latium, but when he rejects her advances out of loyalty to his wife, Circe transforms him into a woodpecker. And Ovid describes this moment quite vividly. He says, "Circe, stirred by rejection, no longer restrained her divine wrath, but with her incantations and bitter herbs, she changed him into a bird, stripping him of human shape." And this act of vengeance underscores her dual nature as both alluring and terrifying, capable of great love, but also of destructive power. And we see that a lot, don't we, with female mythological characters, and we've seen that through all different types of mythology. Think back to pretty much any episode of Ladies of Lore, and they always have this ability to love and nurture and create, but also massive power of destruction as well. And really interestingly, while Circe retains much of her Greek identity in Roman mythology, her story is more deeply embedded in the Italian landscape. In Virgil's Aeneid, Circe is briefly mentioned in connection with the coast of Latium, where her island is said to be located. Virgil describes this island as a place where Circe fills the air with her songs, and the night echoes with her endless weavings of enchantments. And this description aligns with earlier Homeric portrayals of Circe as a seductive and mystical figure, but it also grounds her presence within the Roman mythological framework, linking her to the mythic geography of Italy. And the Roman fascination with Circe extended far beyond poetry into art and philosophy. She was often depicted in Roman frescoes and mosaics, where she was often holding a wand or mixing potions, or surrounded by animals that were probably once men. And this imagery reflects the Roman view of Circe not only as a mythical sorceress, but also as a symbol of transformation and the unpredictability of fate. Philosophers and moralists such as Seneca also referenced Circe as an example of how desire and illusion could corrupt the soul, using her story as a metaphor for the dangers of indulgence and manipulation. So it's pretty clear to see that Greek and Roman portrayals of Circe share a fundamental core. She is an enchantress. She's a goddess or a demigoddess of transformation, and she's a powerful, independent figure who interacts with mortal heroes. However, the way her character is developed and her emotional depth and her thematic significance vary between the two traditions. Greek Circe is primarily a figure of mystery and magical power, while Roman Circe is more psychologically complex, emotionally volatile, and deeply tied to themes of love and vengeance. In Homer's Odyssey, Circe is a sorceress on her island who transforms men into animals, but interestingly, after turning Odysseus's men into swine, she actually later becomes his ally when he resists her magic. So it could be said that in Greek mythology, she serves mainly as a plot device. She's both an obstacle and a helper in Odysseus's journey, without masses of character development. Roman writers also use Circe differently thematically. While Greek stories present her as a supernatural test of Odysseus's wit, Roman literature makes her a moral lesson about desire and temptation. And this is sort of reflective of how Romans transformed many Greek myths to serve their own cultural purposes. Right, I think we've got a good grounding there for Circe in both Greek and Roman traditions, and we know a little bit about what she looks like, and I've touched a teeny tiny bit on stories about her. So I reckon it's about time that we heard some of those stories in full. So first, I'm going to tell you the story of Circe and Odysseus as it was told by the ancient Greeks. As Odysseus and his weary crew sailed through the storm-tossed sea, they came upon an island wreathed in mist and mystery. The domain of Circe lay before them, a place where time itself seemed to drift like a dream, and the air hummed with enchantments unseen. The men, battered by their trials, longed for solid ground and sustenance. But this island was no ordinary haven. It was the dwelling of a sorceress whose power rivaled the gods. Odysseus, ever cautious, sent a scouting party ahead, led by his trusted companion. Through the shadowed woods they came upon a house of polished stone, hidden in a glade where wild creatures prowled. Yet these were no ordinary beasts. Lions and wolves, with eyes gleaming strangely, moved not as predators, but as docile creatures, fawning like hounds at their master's feet. Within the hall, Circe sat weaving at her loom, a goddess-like figure with long curling hair, and a voice that wove spells as surely as her fingers wove threads. Circe, the dread goddess who speaks with human voice, Homer calls her. A woman both feared and desired, whose very name carried the weight of sorcery. With honeyed words, she welcomed Odysseus's men, offering them a feast rich with roast meat and deep cups of ruby-coloured wine. Hunger made them reckless, and they drank deeply, not knowing that Circe's magic was already working upon them. No sooner had they swallowed the potion than their limbs shrank, their backs curved, and bristles burst forth upon their skin. The men, once warriors, now stood as swine, snuffling helplessly upon the ground. Circe laughed, a sound like silver bells, and drove them into pens, leaving them to wallow in their new forms. Only Eurylochus, who had sensed the trap, fled back to Odysseus with the tale. "We went, and we found a palace in the glades," he gasped. "Inside she sat and sang with her lovely voice, but she was a snare. My men drank, and lo, she touched them with her wand, and they became pigs." Odysseus, undaunted, seized his sword and made his way through the darkened forest. Before he could reach Circe's hall, the god Hermes appeared, a youthful figure with winged sandals and cunning eyes. He pressed into Odysseus's hand a stalk of moly, a white-flowered herb with roots as black as night. "This will shield you from her magic," Hermes whispered. "When she bids you drink, do so, but when she raises her wand, rush upon her with your blade. Show her no fear, and she will yield." Odysseus entered the house of the enchantress, where Circe welcomed him as she had the others. She placed the golden cup before him, but when the spell failed to take hold, he sprang up, sword flashing. Circe shrank back, her gaze wide with astonishment. "Who are you," she breathed, "that you resist my magic? No mortal should be able to stand against me." Odysseus, stern and unyielding, demanded his men be restored. And Circe, seeing in him not just another wandering mortal, but a man touched by destiny, relented. With a wave of her staff, the spell unravelled, and where there had been pigs, his crew stood once more, trembling and whole. Circe, who had been their captor, now became their hostess. She led them to steaming baths, dressed them in fresh robes, and set forth a feast, only this time with no hidden poison. And when Odysseus lay beside her, he found not just a sorceress, but a woman who, for all her power, was lonely in her immortality. For a year they lingered in her halls, lost in the warmth of her embrace and the ease of her magic. But Odysseus was a man who could not be tamed by pleasure or bound by love alone. At last he spoke of his longing for home, for Ithaca, for Penelope who waited across endless waves. Circe, though sorrowful, did not seek to keep him. Instead, she guided him onward, telling him of the trials yet to come, the journey to the land of the dead, the perils of Scylla, and the temptations of the sirens. And Odysseus left the island of Circe, his mind heavy with fate, but his heart touched by something rare, the love of a goddess who in the end had freed him rather than bound him. And as the island faded from view behind him, he knew her name would linger in his soul like the scent of her enchanted flowers, both a warning and a whispered memory. And there you have the story of Odysseus and Circe as the ancient Greeks might have known it. And now we wouldn't be ladies of lore if we didn't also check out a Roman tale, so let's talk about the story of Circe, Glaucus, and Scylla.
We'll be right back.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to Pop Off Sis, the podcast where we dive into the latest trends, hot topics, and everything pop culture within music, entertainment, and sports.
I'm Morgan.
And I'm Kendall, the sister duo that is bringing you our unfiltered take on the stuff you care about. Viral music moments, celebrity gossip, and all the sports drama you can handle.
We'll also be reviewing a new cocktail in every episode. Think of hanging with your friends, sipping drinks, and popping off on all things pop culture. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform as episodes drop every other week, and we will see you next time.
Once, Glaucus was a mortal man, a simple fisherman who dwelled by the sea, spending his days among the waves and the spray. But fate would not let him remain so. One day, after hauling in a catch, Glaucus noticed that every fish he laid upon the grass sprang back to life and flopped its way back into the ocean. Astonished, he tasted the grass himself, and in that instant, the gods claimed him. His body convulsed with divine power. Scales overtook his flesh, fins sprouted from his arms, and his legs merged into a powerful tail. He had become a sea god, one of Neptune's own kind, with flowing blue-green hair and eyes as deep as the ocean. From then on, Glaucus roamed the waters, no longer mortal, but still carrying a heart full of human longing. And that longing soon found a focus: Scylla. Scylla was a sea nymph, beautiful beyond words. She wandered the shoreline of Sicily, where she would dip her toes in the tide and let the breeze play with her hair. Glaucus, beholding her from the waves, was smitten, hopelessly and overwhelmingly smitten. He swam close, calling out to her with the voice of the sea. But Scylla recoiled in fear. "Monster!" she cried, repelled by his fish-tailed form and tangled seaweed hair. "Get away from me!" Spurned but not defeated, Glaucus knew he needed help to win her heart, and who better to ask than Circe, the enchantress, famed for her spells and potions and for bending the will of nature itself. Circe, daughter of the sun, mistress of herbs, welcomed Glaucus into her island. He begged her, "Great sorceress, lend me your power, give me a charm, a spell, a potion, anything that will make Scylla love me." But Circe, who had turned Odysseus's men into swine and commanded the very winds, looked at Glaucus and saw more than a desperate lover. She saw a god, and Circe herself was struck by desire, and she offered him her own heart instead. "Why chase a nymph who scorns you," she said, "when I, immortal, powerful, and willing, stand before you?" But Glaucus, ever faithful in his yearning, shook his head. "Scylla is the only one I want." And so Circe, scorned like Glaucus once was, did not weep or plead. She plotted. With rage coiled in her veins, she walked to the edge of her island and brewed a potion darker than midnight. Into it she stirred venom of serpents, foam from rabid dogs, and herbs that screamed when torn from the ground. And then, sailing to Scylla's favourite cove, she poured the potion into the still, clear waters where the nymph bathed. The next time Scylla stepped into the sea, she felt her body twist and contort. She screamed, but the sound was drowned by the churning of the waters. From her waist downward, she split into a ring of snarling, dog-headed tentacles. Her once beautiful form was now monstrous and terrifying. She tried to flee to the shore, but her monstrous limbs would not follow. Scylla was trapped, and she became a sea terror, lurking in the Straits of Messina, snatching sailors from passing ships. Her beauty was lost, her mind still her own, but imprisoned in a grotesque serpentine prison. As for Glaucus, Ovid does not tell us that he ever loved Circe, or that he ever won Scylla. He simply ends the tale with the sea god mourning what had become of his beloved. And Circe, well, she returned to her island, victorious not in love, but victorious in vengeance. And there you go, there's two stories of Circe, one from ancient Rome and one from ancient Greece. And I'll put it over to you for a question. Do you have a preference? I tell you lots of stories from both ancient Greece and ancient Rome, but do you guys have a preference? Do you think that the Roman takes on things are more interesting? Do you think that the Greek takes on things are more interesting? What ones captivate you more? Let me know in the comments. So I think it's about time that we have a little look at Circe after these periods. So let's see what happened after the Roman Empire fell. After the decline of the Roman Empire, Circe gradually faded from cultural prominence, especially in the early medieval period due to the Christianization of Europe, as we very well know discouraged engagements from classical pagan mythology, but echoes of her legend persisted subtly in monastic texts, often reinterpreted through moral or allegorical frameworks. In these Christian contexts, Circe was typically cast as a symbol of carnal temptation or the dangers of feminine guile. Her transformation of men into animals paralleling what theologians described as the bestial consequences of sin. Again, we're seeing it, we get to this period of time, and it's just Christianity comes in and says everybody's a demon, temptress, horrible person, and this is what happens again with Circe. And then the Renaissance came along, and this ushered in a revival of classical learning, and Circe re-emerged with renewed interest. Humanist scholars, poets and artists engaged with Greco-Roman mythology with greater nuance and appreciation. Giovanni Boccaccio's Genealogia Deorum Gentilium of the 1360s, sorry, that was a bit of a mouthful. This revisited Circe not merely as a villainous temptress, but as a complex figure, part of the broader reclamation of classical culture. Similarly, in Ludovico Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, that's a lot of O's, in 1516, and later Torquato Tasso's Jerusalem Liberata of 1581, characters inspired by Circe, such as the sorceress Alcina and Armida, fused erotic power with emotional depths. And these heroines were not just threats to male virtue, but they were tragic figures of desire and love, indicating a shift in literary sensibility. In the 17th century, Circe appeared frequently in Baroque opera and painting. Pietro Metastasio's libretti and Monteverdi's musical settings often showcased enchantresses like Circe as embodiments of passion and artifice, symbolising both the splendour and the danger of sensuality. In visual arts, painters such as Dosso Dossi and later Angelica Kauffmann presented Circe in ambiguous poses, sometimes a bit of a seductress, sometimes a forlorn lover. And this sort of shows the evolution from moral allegory to emotional realism. And I will, as you know, put some links in the show notes so you can have a look at these and see all of the contrasting different ways that Circe has been presented in art. And then the Enlightenment period came along, and this saw a continued engagement with the myth of Circe, but it was often reframed through a more rationalist lens. Writers like Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels of 1726 implicitly referenced Circean themes, especially in places where human behaviour is inverted into animalistic parody. Circe's myth is used here to serve a critique of societal corruption and moral decay in an age fascinated by reason. It was, however, in the Romantic era that Circe's image became more psychologically intricate. Romantics were drawn to the mystical, to the dangerous, and the emotionally extreme. Circe, as a liminal figure between woman and witch, human and divine, became somewhat of a muse for poets, including one of our favourites on Ladies of Law, Alfred Lord Tennyson. And you might remember I read you quite a lot of Tennyson's work when we were talking about Guinevere. So let's have a little look at how Circe appeared in Alfred Lord Tennyson's work. Although Tennyson never writes an extended narrative poem just about Circe, her presence lingers throughout his mythological-infused poetry, most noticeably in pieces like The Lotus Eaters and Ulysses. And these poems, like I said, they don't explicitly name Circe, but they're pretty unmistakable in the reflection of her influence that they contain. She's both a literal figure and a symbolic construct. And Tennyson was writing during the Victorian era, when Britain was sort of grappling with its identity in the face of industrial change and shifting gender roles. It was a really big time of change. It's the Industrial Revolution. There's lots of different moving parts and things changing in people's places in society, changing and morphing. And Tennyson often took classical stories and used them as metaphors for the moral and emotional dilemmas of his time, of all of these things that were changing. And the 19th century was actually a period haunted by the fear of the new woman, educated, independent, and sexually autonomous. And mythological women like Circe were perfect to use as a figure onto which male writers could project their fears and fascinations. In The Lotus Eaters, Tennyson presents a group of mariners who, upon arriving at an exotic land, are offered strange fruit that causes them to forget their homeland and the burdens of return. The poem echoes the episode in the Odyssey where Odysseus's crew encounters the lotus fruit, but more significantly, it resonates with the experience they have on Circe's island that you heard earlier. Here, time slips away and men are seduced into relinquishing their identities. Tennyson's version is steeped in dreamy languor and fatal passivity. Let us swear an oath and keep it with an equal mind, in the hollow lotus land to live and lie reclined, the mariners plead. The poem seduces the reader into a state of stasis, just like Circe seduces Odysseus's men into forgetting their heroic purpose. There is an unmistakable Circean air in this landscape. It's a place of beauty and lethargy, where male agency is completely dissolved by a sensuous, feminized environment. So for the Victorian reader, this could very well have been a bit of a cautionary tale, a bit of a meditation on the dangers of yielding to pleasure, of forsaking duty and national identity for the ambiguous embrace of the other. And if you think about the Victorian period, if you think about sort of the stereotypes that come to your mind when you think of the Victorian period, it's very much sort of stiff, rigid, very moralistic. But you've got to remember, this is also a time when everything is quite literally changing. The landscape is changing. You've got factories popping up everywhere. The Industrial Revolution was not just about industry and factories. There were so many other things involved in it, and ironically this is what I've literally just written an essay about in my university course, which is why I didn't upload last week. So I'm very much in this headspace right now, and it's really interesting to see how that has a knock-on effect on how these ancient tales are reinterpreted to send a new moral message, really, that is relative to the context within which Lord Tennyson was writing in. And then you have Ulysses, which is one of Tennyson's most celebrated dramatic monologues. And here again, Circe is not named, but her shadow hovers somewhat in the background. The aged hero, now king of Ithaca, is restless and discontent. He's returned home, but domestic life chafes against the spirit of adventure that still burns within him. It little profits that an idle king, by this still hearth, among these barren crags, matched with an aged wife, I meet and dole, unequal laws unto a savage race, he declares in the opening lines. The wife in question is Penelope, faithful, domestic, the very opposite of Circe. And yet in this passage we glimpse how both women, in different ways, represent limitations, domesticity on one hand and enchantment on the other. Circe becomes a symbol of the seductive stagnation that Ulysses must resist, just as Penelope becomes emblematic of this life that he's sort of outgrown. His yearning to follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bound of human thought is not only a rejection of complacency, but it's also turning away from the Circean dream of comfort and pleasure. The poem elevates heroic striving and masculine exploration, implicitly portraying feminine influence as something to escape from. And this is a really complex portrayal of Circe, or rather, Circe's influence or spirit, and it can be read as part of Tennyson's broader preoccupation. It can be read as part of Tennyson's broader preoccupation with the perils of feminine power, because it pops up in many of his poems, from Mariana to the Lady of Shalott. All of these women are presented as figures of stasis and emotional intensity, often trapped in liminal spaces and haunted by longing or madness. Think about the quotes that I read you of Guinevere in the moment when Arthur comes to confront her before he goes off to the Battle of Camlan. That was very emotional. That was extremely emotional. So much longing for Lancelot, and then as Arthur rides away, longing for this king that she could have loved. Very, very dramatic. And Circe sort of fits quite naturally into his constellation of symbolic women, but Tennyson doesn't entirely demonise her, because there's this underlying sadness to these poems, and it's a recognition of what there is to be lost if you reject the Circean realm. In The Lotus Eaters, the mariners' voices are persuasive and lyrical. Their desire to escape toil and grief is quite a human thing. In Ulysses, the titular character's drive to escape is heroic, but it's also a little bit selfish and a little bit existential. And Circe kind of becomes not just a symbol of danger, but also a bit of a psychological truth. She's this space where desire and identity can be transformed, even at the cost of the social order. So Tennyson's engagement with the figure of Circe reflects a richly ambivalent Victorian imagination, torn between duty and desire, progress and nostalgia, masculine heroism and feminine mystery. And though she might never appear by name in these poems, her essence definitely can be felt in his work, offering a mirror to Tennyson's cultural moment and to the deeper psychological tensions within his verse. And there's another tangent about Alfred Lord Tennyson in another episode. But, you know, if you guys like this, if you like this sort of literary analysis or me talking a little bit more extensively about this, please let me know, because Tennyson has lots of fantastic poems, like I said, about lots of different women, and often from ancient or classic tales, and I'd love to talk more about them. So if you're interested in that, let me know. Maybe it's something I can put up on the Patreon for those who would like to subscribe to that. And I say all that to say that I'd like to talk about another prose work called Imaginary Conversations by Walter Savage Landor. And this is sort of a intellectual and stylistically daring series of dialogues between historical, mythological and literary figures. And these are conversations composed over several decades in the early 19th century. And they are Landor dramatising philosophical, political and aesthetic debate through the voices of some of history's most compelling minds. And one of the most fascinating parts of this work is how Landor handles mythological characters, because Circe is one of them, and through her he explores not only the persistent themes of temptation, gender and knowledge, but also the nature of conversation itself, its eroticism, its evasiveness, its power, all sorts. And unlike Tennyson, who embeds Circe within the narrative through metaphor and suggestion, Landor actually gives her a direct voice. In the dialogue titled Odysseus and Circe, she appears not as a symbol of moral danger or passive seduction, but more of a sharp-witted and quite articulate woman. She's fully aware of her mythology and she knows the role men have cast her in. And Landor sort of prided himself on giving complexity to historical and often silenced voices, so women. And he presents Circe as not just the sorceress, but as a thinking, feeling human being capable of challenging the heroism and the arrogance of Odysseus. And throughout this exchange, Circe and Odysseus engage in a bit of a rhetorical duel where desire is never far from disdain and affection coexists alongside critique. Circe's tone sort of flits between regret, sarcasm and genuine longing. She says, "You have turned my nymphs into stone with your absence." And that line, it's very playful, but it's also quite painfully poetic. And this isn't the Circe of Homer who has to be outwitted and left behind, but this is a woman with emotional depth who questions her abandonment. She demands to be recognised not just as a a footnote in the story of Odysseus's life, but as a figure of agency and reflection. There's this sort of awareness here of how myths reduce women to episodes in men's narrative. Remember, right at the start of the episode when I said, in Homer's Odyssey, Circe is a bit of a plot device. She's just there to sort of move the story along. But here we have a Circe who's saying, actually, no, I have feelings about this, and I would like to make you aware of them. And Landor was writing in the early 19th century, as I said, so Romanticism was sort of battling it out with Enlightenment, rationalism, and there's lots of political revolutions throwing things into question, and the imaginary conversations were deeply modern in their psychological insight. And Circe becomes a way for Landor to probe the tensions between myth and memory, between this idea of homeliness, but also the pull of the unknown. Odysseus in this dialogue is not the restless idealist of Tennyson's Ulysses, but a more humanised and wearied traveller, and his exchange with Circe reveals a deep ambivalence about their journey. And their conversation is filled with emotional reversals. What begins as flirtation slowly turns to critique, and what seems like regret masks resentment. And it's just a really fascinating read, because Landor sort of subverts the genre of heroic mythos, and Odysseus is usually the epitome of cunning and masculine resilience, but here he's a bit dismantled by Circe's intellect and emotional candour. He's not the master of every domain anymore, but he's just a man a little bit uncomfortable by a woman being quite clear with him about how she feels. And Landor's Circe is not monstrous, but she's also not divine. She's just really human, and I think therein lies her power. She resists being a metaphor, and she is in fact just a person. And the implications are political. It's not just a literary thing, because in giving her this voice, Landor was actually doing something really rare for his time. He was writing a female character who owns her narrative, who questions the structures that contain her, and who speaks not just to her lover, but to posterity. So yeah, there's another tangent, which I hope you've enjoyed, but Landor's portrayal of Circe in Imaginary Conversations is such a stark departure from conventional mythic readings, because she's not just a symbol of seduction or the dangers of feminine temptation or whatever they usually cast us as, but she's actually reimagined as a speaker, a thinker. She's a subject in her own right, and through her, Landor elevates the genre of the dialogue into something so much more emotionally and intellectually rich. It's not just a reinterpretation of a myth, but it's the reclamation of a voice. And it suggests that conversations worth preserving are not those where heroes speak and women are silent, but those where both stand equally in the play of words, memory, and desire. And that's just such an interesting take to me. I will 100% be going and reading all of this. And you know I'll put the links in the show notes so you can have a read of it too. And if you do read it, please let me know what you think in the comments below or over on TikTok, or shoot me it's not a tweet, is it? Shoot me a post on Blue Sky. I don't know what they're called. They're not tweets. They're not... Shoot me a Blue Sky on Blue Sky and let me know what you think. So throughout these centuries, all the way up to the Victorian period, Circe was increasingly understood less as a symbol of female vice and more of a prism through which to explore power, desire, identity, and alienation. By the modern day, interpretations of Circe had swung dramatically from medieval condemnation to romantic fascination, and she was now positioned as a potent metaphor for the complex intersections of gender, knowledge, and transformation. And that sets us up very nicely to talk about Circe in the modern day. In modern-day society, Circe has experienced a vivid cultural renaissance, evolving far beyond the confines of ancient myth to become a resonant symbol of power, transformation, and female agency across literature, music, visual arts, film, television, and even gaming. And one of the things at the heart of this revival is Madeline Miller's 2018 novel, Circe, which was a landmark reinterpretation that repositions the once maligned sorceress as the emotional and moral centre of her own story. It's told from Circe's perspective, and it's both an act of mythic revisionism and a profound feminist statement. Stripped of her traditional villainy, Circe emerges not as a threat to men, but as a woman forging her own identity in defiance of divine cruelty and patriarchal expectation. She's cast out by her family, dismissed by gods and heroes alike, and yet she grows into herself through solitude, craft, and hard-earned compassion. Miller's prose is lyrical and intimate, and what was once a marginal figure in the Odyssey becomes under her hand a fully realised voice of resistance, care, and self-discovery. Circe's turning of men into pigs, once a symbol for seductive wickedness, becomes a metaphor for reclaiming boundaries, and for protecting oneself from the entitled violence of those who assume their dominance. In Miller's version, Circe isn't just a supporting character in a man's journey, she is a woman struggling against the constraints of divine law and male power. She hones her craft, she defies the gods, and she carves out her own destiny. And Miller's Circe has been praised for its deep psychological insight and lyrical prose. As Circe herself reflects in the novel, "When I was born, the name for what I was did not exist. They called me nymph, assuming I would be like my mother and aunts and 1,000 other women they had known. Least of the lesser, I thought. And yet, something must be different about me. For instead of knitting at the loom, I learned the ways of the earth, the songs of the herbs and roots, the words of power." Here, Circe becomes more than just a mythological figure. She is a voice for every woman who has been underestimated or constrained or forced to forge her own way. And I know there is a lot of discourse, especially if you go on Book Talk, about the mythological retellings, especially things like Circe, like the Song of Achilles, Herc, just hundreds of other retellings. There are so many of them. On the whole, I think I'm a fan. I didn't enjoy some of them, but I did enjoy a lot of them. And if I'm honest, I really did enjoy the Song of Achilles. Okay, I enjoyed it for what it was. I cried like a little baby. In fact, there is somewhere there is actually a picture of me crying with snot and everything after I read that book. So, I think the greatest thing about myths is that they are retold. And I think sometimes we forget that the modern day retellings, it's kind of a little bit like what the Romans did to the Greek version of the tale, We're just doing it now in the modern day. And it's okay to like them, but it's also okay not to like them. But let me know in the comments, what are your favourite mythological retellings? Because I would like to read more of them. Speaking of retellings, Circe also appears in the Percy Jackson series, where she runs a luxury spa that secretly transforms men into guinea pigs, which was a bit of a humorous nod to her Homeric roots. And she also shows up in DC Comics, and she's a powerful sorceress there and one of Wonder Woman's most formidable foes. And the contemporary reimaginings have gone far beyond the page. Circe's resurgence in music can also be seen in the works of artists who draw on witchcraft and myth as expressions of female empowerment. So you've got musicians like Florence and the Machine or Lana Del Rey, who sometimes evoke this sort of Circean presence in their blending of ethereal femininity and mystic defiance. And I am a huge Florence and the Machine fan, such a big Florence and the Machine fan, and you can definitely see these sort of influences and how they weave their way into the music. And the music often puts women in this sort of liminal space between desire and danger, enchantment and exile, mirroring the complex terrain that Circe herself occupies. And she also pops up in visual arts, where she's frequently depicted not as a seductress, but as a solitary figure surrounded by symbols of transformation. Things like herbs, animals, and lunar imagery. Contemporary painters and illustrators often draw on this witchcraft iconography to represent Circe, and they merge her mythological roots with the aesthetics of modern spirituality, particularly within pagan and Wiccan communities, where Circe herself is actually embraced as an archetype of natural power and solitary wisdom. And although there's not been a major blockbuster movie centred on Circe herself, her influence is unmistakable in the rising number of witch-like characters and morally ambiguous female leads in both film and television. You've got characters like Melisandre in Game of Thrones or Wanda Maximoff in WandaVision, and they inherit this legacy of women whose powers alienate them, who straddle that boundary between saviour and threat, and whose narratives interrogate the cost of power and the burden of female independence. And these sort of portrayals underscore society's growing interest in feminine power that doesn't actually require apology or temperance. And we love a video game on Ladies of Lore, and Circe and Circe-like figures often appear there as powerful sorceresses who challenge or assist the protagonist. She appears in games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which is one of my favourite games, and the Greek mythos here is deeply embedded into the whole story. And you also see influences of Circe a bit more indirectly in characters like Yennefer from The Witcher, another one of my favourite games. And these are figures whose strength lie not only in magic, but also in intelligence and self-possession and emotional complexity. And another fantastic game that Circe pops up in is the video game Hades. And there she features as an unseen but very referenced figure, highlighting her continued presence in contemporary storytelling. And Hades, again, if you've not played that, you definitely should take a look. It's very, very good. It's very fun. And the graphics and the design, just very beautiful. And it is all about characters from Greek mythology. And I suppose overarching all of this is the theme of feminism. And that just plays such a crucial role in Circe's modern-day resurrection. She was once vilified for refusing to conform to the expectations of gods and heroes, and Circe now serves as a feminist icon for reclaiming that narrative power. In early interpretations, she was the embodiment of male fears. She was an independent woman who emasculated men and resisted containment. And today, that very independence is what we celebrate. Feminist readings of Circe highlight how she embodies the journey from marginalisation to self-definition, from voicelessness to authorship. Her island is not a prison, but it's a space of creative freedom and autonomy. Madeline Miller's Circe in particular captures this shift, and it speaks to the contemporary readers who are weary of stories where women just exist to support male arcs. Circe's transformation from an unloved daughter of Helios to a self-made woman who chooses her own path on her own terms reflects a deeper cultural hunger for stories where women are not punished for power or complexity or solitude. In a world that still, to this day, debates women's autonomy over their bodies and their identities and their voices, Circe's narrative stands as a myth reborn, a story of exile that becomes emancipation, of magic that becomes a metaphor for knowledge, care, and resistance. And in academic discourse, Circe has become central to feminist classical studies. For instance, Deborah Lyons in Dangerous Gifts, Gender and Exchange in Ancient Greece, which I would definitely recommend you having a read of, there is a fascinating exploration of Circe's gift-giving and transformation as transgressive acts within patriarchal structures. Adrian Mayer's Goddess and the Bull contextualises figures like Circe within the archaeology of power and gender, aligning mythic sorceresses with historical matriarchal systems. And scholars also compare Circe with contemporary icons of resistance, arguing that she anticipates the feminist witch archetype, akin to the reclamation of Medusa in The Laugh of Medusa. And I will put all of the links in the show notes to all of the things that I've just mentioned so you can have a bit more of an extensive read if you like. And if you're interested in hearing me talk a little bit more about those things, maybe pulling out some quotes, having a little bit more of a deep dive, please do let me know in the comments. Again, that is something I can pop over on the Patreon or maybe even into a second episode on Circe. But Circe's return in modern consciousness isn't just a revival of an old tale, it's truly a reclamation. She emerges from the ancient texts, like I said, not as a footnote in Odysseus' journey, but as a full figure, walking into the contemporary world, bearing all of the scars and all of the wisdom of her long exile. Her story now belongs not only to mythologists, but to you, to artists, to feminists, to readers, and anyone who has ever had to rewrite their story from the margins. She has ceased to be the other woman and become a voice of necessary defiance and poetic resilience. And today, Circe is no longer a warning tale of dangerous femininity. She is a cultural icon. She's a figure of metamorphosis, resistance, and spiritual sovereignty. From literature to gaming, she represents a broader shift in how mythic women are viewed, not as aberrations, but as mirrors of strength and survival. So, Circe has transformed just as much as the men she enchanted. Once a cautionary figure, she's become an emblem of independence, knowledge, and resistance. From Homer to Ovid to Madeline Miller, from mythology to modern-day media, Circe refuses to be silenced. Her story reminds us that magic, whether that's in the form of spells, wisdom, or sheer willpower, is often a woman's only weapon in a world that seeks to control her. And as long as we continue to tell her story, Circe will never fade into myth. I think that's about it. That's all we've got time for today on Ladies of Lore. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you so much, and I really hope that you have enjoyed today's dive into the story of Circe. If you have enjoyed it, please don't forget to subscribe or follow, or whatever the word may be, on your favourite podcast platform. Please also feel free to leave me a comment if you can. You can always send me a message over on TikTok or Blue Sky, and if you're feeling extremely generous, you could leave me a review on your favourite podcast platform too. But once again, thank you so very much for joining me. I'll be back next week to unravel another thread in the rich tapestry of women in mythology and folklore.